Hey everybody, welcome to SF Indie Fest Screen Film Festival of San Francisco. It's really great to be here. As the kind of pandemic slowly begins to ease, we're able to be in this hybrid format. So some of you might have seen the film live at the Roxy, and some of those you virtually at home or wherever you've decided to watch films. It was really exciting to run across this film, War and Weather, that you've just had a chance to see. And we're lucky enough to have the writer-director of the film, Enid Baxter-Rice. Welcome, Enid. And we have producer and one of the stars of the film, Kusla Kessler-Mata. Thanks for being here, Kusla.
Thanks for having us.
I think, maybe a good place to start is, what was the initial inspiration for the film Enid, and how did you put the team together that we see on screen?
Oh, thank you. And I just want to first apologize in advance. My 7-year-old is home and I can hear the noise rising. So I had for years worked on a project called Water California, and was with another artist named Nicole Antebi. And one of my jobs was to put together a history of water in California, which, had I known what that meant, I never would have agreed to that job. But as I was doing that research, I came across this book, War and the Weather, that was one of those books that was a bestseller and, had a lot of impact on our culture and on history. And then, because it wasn't really accurate, sort of faded from memory. And so I've always been sort of fascinated by that book and its theory. Lauren Buffalo Muscatine and I, who's the first scientist who speaks in the film, had worked together on other projects previously. And we like to check in every now and then and see what each other is up to. Right now, Lauren has created the Napa Seed Library in Napa, California, so you can check that out. But Lauren at that time called me up and said, "What are you thinking about?" And I had been hearing a lot about atmospheric rivers just in the little science circles I was traveling in. And I said, "This is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about atmospheric rivers in relation to this book that predicted warfare causing rain, and wondering if there was any kind of impact of these new phenomena on how the West was colonized." And she said, "I'm editing the first ever science book about atmospheric rivers." And so then we just started talking, and that was the beginning of the project. I had been working with Philip Glass on the Days and Nights Festival for several years, and the producer of the festival, Jim Woodard, was visiting my studio and saw the book on my desk and said, "What is this?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on this new film." And he said, "Oh, I think Philip would love this." And so we talked to Philip, and he decided he wanted to have the project developed at the Philip Glass Days and Nights Festival. And that's how he's in the film, and his music is on the project. I had met Kusla because our kids were in summer camp together. we just really liked each other and had tons to talk about. And then as I was working on the film, I realized that Kusla was the person whose perspective needed to be in the film, and really became the center and the heart of the film. And the film shifted from being a film about atmospheric rivers and colonization to being a film about stories.
And how did you feel about being asked to be part of the project, Kusla? And how did you guys collaborate, I guess, in the way that you wanted to tell the story?
Yeah, sure. So I think Enid is very generous in her reading of me. I think we really connected because, there's a number of different points of connection, but primarily because her approach to her work and to her life is very inclusive, and it tries to be holistic and looking at the world around her. And so I felt when I shared my perspective with her, she really listened. And I felt like it could, it wasn't, sometimes actually some of what I was saying wasn't actually, I didn't know, right, what relevance it had, but Enid saw something, right? And so that to me she made connections that perhaps I didn't at first see. And so that to me was very helpful in even processing my own thoughts and ideas. So, and that's just even on a daily life, personal, relationship kind of basis, but applied to her work, it's, I think even more extraordinary. And so the storytelling, I think, is a natural process for her, and I think she captures it well in her work, in her film. But really, I jump on board anytime Enid asks me to do something, because she's great to work with.
What was that interview process like? I mean, in the sense that there's kind of abstract elements of the film. I mean, were there, kind of like, was it more of like a conversation, or did you have kind of like, kind of these questions that you guys collaborated on together ahead of time? Like, what was that process? Because there's just something very organic about the way that the film feels.
Yeah, I mean, if I'll maybe perhaps say something first. I do remember sitting in a bookstore with Enid down in Pacific Grove, and talking about some of the different things that she was noticing in the work, in the book, War and the Weather. And so after that conversation, I just went right into the bookshop and just started digging off the shelves and purchased a whole bunch of things that, of course, looked relevant to the time period, right? So we're talking about mid-19th century California, and really, which is I'm a huge fan of that time period anyway. I mean, that's a weighted statement. I'm California Indian, so I've long studied kind of the genocide and so on and so forth that happened in that era. But the narratives that we have that come out, the written narratives and work, are just fascinating. And so you really do see and get a strong picture for how colonization, right, the efforts at colonizing the Sacramento River and all these other confluences in California took place. They were very, concerted efforts to settle in lands that were not intended to be settled. And so reading and revisiting that literature was really enjoyable for me. I mean, it's again, a strange way to say it, but it's kind of my happy place reading books, right? So, and then to be able to talk with Enid about that and talk about some of the things that I was revisiting and finding again in the works was quite enjoyable.
Yes,
And then,
we did meet in a bookstore, and I tried to talk Kusla into being in the film. And our interview literally was in Pebble Beach, where Kusla was living at the time. And the thing about Pebble Beach is everyone's always doing home improvements. So there's like always this construction noise, and our crew was all students and young women. And Kusla's oldest was doing the, was the set photographer. And so it was a lot of young people, and it was very fun. And it's fun too, like Charles, who's in the film, the NOAA scientist, I met him through our children being friends. And then I wanted to just mention Will Cowan, who is a producer on the film, and you hear his voice telling the story of the Brewer Diaries. And the way that I met Will was the Bill Deverell, the historian at the Huntington Center for the American West, lets me come down and road test my projects with his history PhD candidates. It's really terrifying.
that's awesome.
Yeah, I go and I bring like a PowerPoint, like, here's what I'm talking about. And, if you look at a timeline of the film, it goes from Plutarch to Alex Jones, which is like not something historians do. And so, artists get to do silly things like that. But Will, it turned out, happened to be writing his dissertation on the history of the atmospheric river storm of 1861, 62. And so he became also a really important part of developing the project. And I really wanted his voice to be in the film.
Neat. Well, it kind of makes me think of two questions I'd like to kind of throw at you. Is that, as part of SF Indie Fest, we try to kind of explore lots of different kind of cinematic voices, and just kind of champion kind of eclecticism and, lots of just kind of interesting independent films from around the world. But we don't often get to share what might be kind of categorized as experimental films as much as we would like. And so I think one thing that the audience might be interested in is like, what's the process like in kind of like creating an experimental film, in the sense of like, how might that be different than, a more kind of traditional documentary that we might have seen on, a similar, like, because there's definitely kind of a very kind of artistic and kind of creative approach. So like, how did you come up with the visual aesthetic for the film, and how is this your process in making this film maybe different than maybe some of the other documentaries we might see during the festival?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I'm so lucky I teach, in a film school and I work with very traditional filmmakers. And I always think I'm making a really traditional film too. And then it just turns out different. And I think, there is a really structured way to develop a film screenplay. As a lot of people know, the 3-act structure, and you really try to hit certain points at certain moments. If you're writing a narrative film, there's literally like, by page 38, this should happen in your structure. And so I'm a visual artist, and I didn't go to film school. And so I sort of came into film sideways and didn't know all those things. Um, there is something really important about experimental film to make it successful. And that is that it's not like loosey goosey, anything goes. And this is, I teach experimental filmmaking, and, then you end up with the movie In the Ring, where it's just like a loose association and it's toxic. You have to kind of come up with a structure that you stick to, so your audience kind of knows how to watch your film and trusts your film, that you know what you're doing. So it's even more structured in some ways. When you're doing a less traditional film, you have to think more about the structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that kind of provides a neat insight in the process. And so the other question I had is just, with the kind of very kind of big picture and important issues that are kind of discussed in the film, like when somebody walks out of the theater or, finishes watching the film, like what are some of the things that both of you would like people to kind of keep in mind, or at least, kind of ruminate on as they kind of then go about their life?
Do you want to go first, Kusla?
Well, one, don't shoot aimlessly into the sky with bullets and such, as was done in trying to wage war against the weather. But more seriously, I think it's the sense that settler colonialism actually wasn't necessarily a solution to a lot of things, and created a whole host of problems that maybe help us shine a light back into the insights that especially Indigenous communities had. There were reasons why, folks didn't camp out year round in a floodplain, right? And maybe we need to consider that there's knowledge that can be brought to bear on the kind of new era that we're entering with climate change. So that would be most significant to me.
Yeah, I
Amen.
think making the film, I was really thinking about how we're in a relationship with the sky, and we're in a relationship with um, the landscape and the plants and the weather and the animals. And, we are not, it's not possible for us to control the weather. It's not possible for us to extract everything from the earth and not be in a relationship with it. And that was what I was thinking about a lot when I was working on the film. The film was done for a long time, like 2 years before I could share the film. And that's because the story that's in the film, that Larry Schick, who's also a scientist in the film, in his interview said, there's a Lilwat story that really reflects the hydrology of atmospheric rivers. He's a scientist, he's the Army Corps of Engineers person. And I, after the interview, I said, have you reached out to them? Like, have you talked? And he hadn't. So the process of being allowed to have that story in the film, and being so honored to have Alison Pascal actually tell the story, that was a 2-year process. And so when you're working with, it doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or not, if you're working with a tribe that's not your own, or even if it's your own, sometimes there is a process by which you have to approach and get permission and to do research or tell stories. During that 2 years, so when the film premiered at the National Gallery of Art, it was in the middle of the pandemic, which is really sad to me. But Alex Jones had been in the film for a while, but now conspiracy theory has sort of made its way into like my main thoughts about the film too, which is this idea that people speak very adamantly about scientific ideas when they are conspiracy theorists, because it's a very uncomplicated way to think about things. and that's something to watch out for. And that the scientists in the film are really careful about how they talk and how they attribute things. And that makes it maybe less fun and less convincing to listen to them. But that's a problem.
That's an interesting way to think about it, the kind of the contrasts of the way that people approach, science. That's something I'll probably be paying attention to here over the next few weeks. Thank you again for making such a beautiful and kind of thought-provoking film and sharing it with us here at the Green Film Festival, San Francisco. Have a great day, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having it. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Bye.